And welcome to the Yukon Artists at Work, Artist in the Window. This week we have Amber Church. I'm delighted to have her here. She spent years. How long were you a member of y'all?
A long time. Quite a few years, I don't know.
Yeah. And then she left to focus on making a fabulous little girl named Inara. And now she's back as one of our non-member artists. The funding from Arts in the Park and the Yukon Arts Fund makes that possible, and I'm very grateful for those supports which make it possible to have the artists doing their work in the window and talking with people and also talking with you in the form of this video tonight. So I want to start off by expressing my gratitude to get to live and explore culture here on the traditional territory of the Tagish-Kwan people, where the Kwanlin First Nation and the Tagish-Kwan Council govern, and I'm very grateful that they do. And I've acknowledged our funders, so without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Amber.
Hi.
So, Amber, tell me a bit about what you're doing in the window this week.
So, for the last while, I've been doing a project that's been exploring landscape, largely sort of prompted by taking the aforementioned tiny girl Inara, who has just turned 4, across the country with me and experiencing sort of really iconic Canadian landscapes again through her eyes, and just like that wonder and awe she has of them, but also because of my background working in both in activism and then in conservation and in climate change, also seeing sort of both sides of the coin of those landscapes. And so really I kind of felt like I owed it to her to show the full picture. So telling stories that are both about the beauty and this iconic wonder and etc., but also that sort of darker side of pieces. And so that project has been evolving in the last little while. And I recently got the opportunity to take a trip on the Hart River. I actually am only back a few days ago. Turns out this is a tan, not dirt, which was a wonderful discovery to make after 2 weeks on the river. I wasn't totally sure until I had the shower. And on the trip, I had a sketchbook with me, and I was doing all kinds of sketches as I went along. And so in the window this week, I'm taking some of that work, both the photographs and the sketches, and starting to evolve it into a larger piece that's about the Hart River and the landscapes there, but also about the sort of pressures and pieces that have been human pieces that have been acting on that river. For example, the whole Peel court case that we've just managed to come out of. So this is kind of some of the start. So I've been drawing mountains the last few days, and it will eventually be built into a much larger canvas. But right now I've been doing a lot of ink and watercolor in the window the last 2 days.
So the piece behind you, is that also about the Hart River in a way?
Yeah, exactly. So this piece is about the Peel watershed as a whole, and so this is actually it's called the Yukon's most famous map because that's the planning boundary for the Peel Watershed Land Use Plan, which became such a iconic fight here in the Yukon and all the way to the Supreme Court of Canada and captured international attention and imagination. And this boundary became like a really sort of iconic view for Yukoners. They see the watershed this way, but we all got very used to it, seeing it broken into the units that we as people made it, so what's called the landscape management units. And I really wanted to show it as it actually is. And so instead of breaking this into boundaries arbitrarily made by us, it's broken into the ecoregion boundaries. And the elevation that you see throughout the image is actually, if it's a higher elevation, it's higher elevation in real life. And so I wanted to talk to what that landscape actually is, as opposed to what we think of it as.
I wonder, could you take it off the wall and sort of show the screen what you mean by the elevation? Like, yeah. I think you kind of have to look at it sideways a bit.
So if you're looking, essentially, with a lot of the work I've been doing recently, I've been mounting on foam core. And so I build layers into the piece. So I will draw the image and then cut it all up and hope to God I don't mess up as I'm cutting, especially when I get into some of the really detailed stuff. And then build up layers so that I like the pieces to interact a bit more the viewers. And one way I find to do that is to come off the 2D space and kind of come into invade their space, as it were. And that I'm finding is allowing me to do that. So.
Yeah. So are the blue lines rivers flowing into there?
Mm-hmm. So blue lines are the rest of the boundary. So like that's the other piece of this is we think of this as a really distinct unit, and it's just like the peel. But in reality, these ecoregions continue off down and off these maps, and so it's a much more connected landscape than we tend to think about it because of how the legal battles and the planning process have sort of captured people's imagination. We forget that actually this is also part of this.
Yeah, maps. One of the things maps do is delineate borders. That's part of the language they use, is sort of cutting land into little pieces. Seems to be one of their functions. Whereas that's really quite arbitrary when you're actually out there. Is that part of what you're trying to?
Absolutely, it's incredibly arbitrary when you're out there, and I mean, you can look at it. I think you see it coming through in lots of talk of reconciliation too. With traditional territories don't line up with provincial boundaries, for example, and ecoregions don't line up with anything we draw on a map. We just cut them in half with a national border, for example. And when we're actually trying to think about conservation and think about these landscapes we need to protect and how we do that, we often get hamstrung by imposed jurisdictions that we've put onto things. So.
Yeah, I think that there were a group of scholars who were coming up who were connected in some way with Yukon College, who were engaged in border studies in particular. My friend Teresa Vandermeer Chassé, who's an Upper Canada artist, her traditional territory, like Canada, the US, it doesn't mean anything in her culture, really, like not very far back anyway. So that's interesting. So you're pushing. So can you tell me a bit about like what are the different ecoregions that you're depicting there?
So
or one of them.
So the peel is made up of a few, obviously, as you can see here, but the McPherson Highlands, which is up in here, it extends into what we think of as, right now the Dawson Land Use Plan is actually being planned, and it extends that way, but it also extends down throughout Nacho-Naniak-Dance territory and down into sort of more central Yukon. And it's incredibly dense forest, huge mountains, very thick wetlands. Some good bugs in the mix too. But it's interesting because it's so. It's all the conversations right now on the Beaver River area in Nacho-Naniak-Dance territory as well, and Itak resources. All of this this is all part of that same area. When we're talking about things like moose and caribou and the species that are migrating through these and habitating in these areas, like it doesn't stop at this line. We just drew a line there. And admittedly, in fairness to everyone involved, like there is at least a watershed boundary going on in here for like sort of the bigger map to an extent, but still we just drew a line. So
one of the things that struck me about the Peel situation, it seemed like part of what the conflict hinged on is exactly what does consultation mean.
Absolutely.
Especially in like Yukon First Nations land claims negotiations contexts, because it doesn't mean, well, I'll ask you what dress I want to wear and then I'm going to wear whatever dress I want. Like it's
really good analogy for it.
that isn't what it means.
That's pretty much what happened.
Yeah, so that is pretty much, And so from my much more limited than yours, I think, reading about the issue, I thought that was sort of the interesting philosophical point almost that some of the legal work hinged upon. It's like, so what does consultation mean?
And also very much it hinged on the intention of an agreement. So whereas you can take a a legal agreement like the Umbrella Final Agreement, which is a modern day First Nations treaty, and you can read it like just word for word and take the, let's say, standard legal definition of this word, and this is what it means, and therefore I will interpret it this way. But that court case really hinged on what was the intention of those who were writing at the time, so both the First Nations leadership and the federal government and the territorial government, and looking sort of beyond just the black and white on the text on the page and what the intention behind it was, and making sure that we're honoring not just the black and white text but the intention. And that is a really for us to have won in the Supreme Court of Canada was a very powerful moment, I think, for especially all the First Nation leadership, to say that yes, like, it is important to honor what we intended to do, even if we didn't express it, and
or even if you could take these words and make them mean something.
Yeah, if you could
twist.
Yeah, if you could twist this.
Yeah.
That's not how this is not in law. We're not going to twist it. We're gonna stay with what it was intended to be. So, which is a really powerful concept, I think, because especially, I think in law, there's lots of times where things do hinge on how you can twist that black and white word. So, yeah.
So can you tell me, so I think, do you want to talk a little bit more about where this work comes out of?
Yeah, for sure. So, I guess it comes from a couple places. So for those who are maybe familiar with work I've done in the past, a lot of people know me for sort of the mixed media collage stuff, and very sort of happy and joyful and that piece. And when I started doing that work, I'd been working at the United Nations on climate change at the time when Stephen Harper was in power in Canada, and it was a really hard time to be a Canadian working on climate change. And I just needed an outlet that was happy. And that gave me it. Yeah. And I'm very grateful and blessed that people really identified with that, and it made a big difference. And it seemed people spoke to me about how it made a big difference in their lives as well. So that was an extra wonderful, powerful piece to that. But I think I've now come far enough and had enough space from that slightly traumatic period of my life, but also spent enough time working on other incredibly important environmental campaigns, the Peel being one, but I'm working a lot with Yukon Parks on conservation and a number of things that I felt like I could bring that part of my life back into the work. And also I felt like with Anara, I kind of owed it to her to start telling those stories more openly, and not everything has to be happy all the time. There's lots of power in that too, and I felt like I had the let's say emotional reserve to start doing those stories. The other piece of it, which is really important to me, is, so my background is in science. I'm actually trained as a scientist, a glaciologist and a geologist and a climate scientist, which is maybe not the typical path for someone who then becomes a visual artist.
There are lots of Yukon artists who don't follow a typical path.
This is true.
We have different paths up here.
We do. We don't do it the same as everybody else. Joyce Majeski, for example, is a biologist.
Yeah.
And so it's, I really wanted to be able to start taking some of that world, so the science, the research, the policy, and bringing it into the work. And so like this piece, for example, that's sitting right here, this is Banks Island up in the Arctic, and what you're looking at in terms of the lines are the permafrost slumps. So the outline, the far outline is, the island as it was first surveyed, and then this tiny little bit here is a mentor of mine. When he first did some of his research up there, that's the only places there were slumps happening. And this line, all of this, is what's happening now. It's almost 800% increase. And so I wanted to find a way to start bringing some of that hard research and data into the work without it being like hitting you over the head with it, or like making another graph. And so I've been really enjoying putting some of that in. And one of the pieces that's sitting in the window right now, one of the large ones, is the Ice Fields Parkway and the reduction of ice over time, and then the predictions for where it's going in future. And let's face it, I think anyone who pays any attention to the news probably knows that's not a very happy story. But you can still make a really beautiful piece of work, but then that also tells that story.
So, and that, in terms of the future, leads nicely into my next question, which is where do you hope these pieces go? Or are there any upcoming shows, or is there any, have you got a twinkle in your eye about a particular body of work you want to make? Or?
Well, so some of this came together in a show just recently that was held at the Hilltop Bistro at Yukon College until COVID shut everything down.
Yeah.
There was a joke that I was going to have the longest running show ever in the bistro because no one could get in there to take it down, even though no one could see it. But I would like to, I'd say it's more of a twinkle in my eye in terms of the next step, but I have a bunch of ideas as far as pieces go and trying to make it into a much greater body of work that then can be built into a much larger exhibition. I don't have like a specific sort of location for that yet, but I feel like there's a lot of stories, especially here in Canada. I feel like there's I think a lot of the world looks at us and they're like, Canada, it's beautiful, it's wonderful, and they sometimes miss those stories, and so I want to really help lend a voice to the juxtaposition that's going on all over this country right now. That's I think a lot of people go to Banff and they're like, it's beautiful, it's Banff, and you're like, well, yeah, but it's also overrun, and and they're having huge problems because of that in terms of management, for example, or I mean a really easy one is the cod fishery and in Newfoundland, or the logging practices in Haida Gwaii. And I think it's worth spending a bunch more time trying to tell those stories, and what form that ultimately comes out in, as far as an exhibition or whatever else, I'm not quite sure yet, but I'm enjoying telling them. So
Excellent. Thank you, Amber.
you're welcome.
Maybe I'll turn to Dee now. And Dee, do you have any questions for Amber?
Well, I just want to say I really appreciate the direction that you've taken. It's heartfelt 100 times over. It's awesome. And I can fully relate in having a scientific background and just trying to find ways to present beauty in real issues. And yeah, I can completely collaborate with you on that.
We should probably actually collaborate, Dee. We should really do something together.
Maybe we should, hey? Let's work on that.
Okay. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for coming. Oh, sorry, did you have another question?
Oh, I just wanted to ask about, like, I just find the topic fascinating about the boundaries and traditional borders, and my internet is unstable apparently, but I just wonder how you can see, organizations working together to maybe come up with a better solution for these borders, especially as our climate is changing, and how can this be helped?
It's a great question, and it's a tricky one, especially because I think, to your point about climate, we can put a protected area on something. We're like, great, green box on the map, and then it doesn't do as much good if everything migrates outside of the green box because the climate has shifted. And I think it's one that a lot of people are struggling with right now, because as people, we like to put things in boxes. We like to draw lines and we order our world. The reason we've been drawing maps for, I don't know, however many thousands of years is because it's one way that we can make sense of everything around us.
Yeah, and it's the dominant Canadian Eurocentric habits of thought, right?
Absolutely. It's we're all trained in it, and I'm as guilty as anyone. Being trained in geology, like I learned to map things. Like that's what you do. And it's the same in any of the physical sciences and biology, etc. Like we map things. It's how we make sense of the world. And in terms of how we start to shift that problem, that challenge that we're now facing with, it turns out that just sticking a line on something arbitrarily on a map doesn't always actually doesn't actually represent reality, or doesn't work for what we're trying to protect or conserve is, I'd love to say I had an answer, and unfortunately I don't.
Yeah.
But I think a lot of people are right now, I think especially with climate change, are acutely aware of it, and are trying to think if there are ways that we can make those boundaries more fluid or more malleable or changeable with time. And fortunately, again, our Eurocentric land ownership system doesn't necessarily make that easier, but I think it's something that a lot of people are trying to grapple with right now. And I mean, as far as making paintings about it, it's maybe all I'm doing is making people think about it for a second. But even that, I think, is helpful because most people don't. I did a piece that it's a giant map of Canada, and it's the same as this. It's eco zones, and people would be like, well, where's BC? And I'm like, well, it's part of this one and it's part of this, and because it's not how we're used to seeing it, so it's not how we think about
side,
it.
right?
Yeah, exactly, exactly. It's not labeled as British Columbia because that's not what I was trying to show them. So.
Interesting. I wonder if, like you were talking about, honoring the intention of things, and I wonder if that might be part of the way through, instead of trenching and retrenching boundaries.
Yeah.
Trying to figure out how to honor, how to have those intentions be shared intentions.
Yeah,
so that they're held in common and yeah. Anyway, good work. And I think, I mean, presenting people with these maps and getting them to reconsider the tools that they use for thinking is probably an important step in that direction.
I think it probably is. And I think sometimes
Absolutely,
going back
you're doing your job.
Yeah. Even having people go back to
as an artist,
how other things are, how we have thought about things in the past. Like my husband Tyler did part of his master's at Oxford, and he got to Oxford, he got a piece of the commons. Like you get, your textbooks and your room key and a piece of the commons, which is to graze your cow, apparently. Not that Tyler had a cow, but they still give you a piece of like
to put your
like
milk in your tea. You're gonna have to have a piece of the commons for your cow.
Exactly. So like it's something from like hundreds and hundreds of years ago. And I mean, anyone who spent time studying environmental theory has probably heard the tragedy of the commons, where if we all own it, then we don't treat it as well, and so that comes with its own set of challenges. But nonetheless, like the fact that something is still commonly owned, or when you go back farther into indigenous cultures and traditional territories, and that's a whole other way of looking at it, and in terms of how we share the land and how we live on it, and if we own it at all. And I think those are all things that we can probably look back to and learn from as we're trying to reevaluate how we do these things.
I think about the commons a lot, actually, and the Yukon Artists at Work really is we create a commons in order to create a sort of a sense of commonwealth. Hopefully.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Anyway, cool. Anything further from Dee? Do you have anything else to say?
Congratulations, thanks, and good job on presenting new material for art.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Amber. If you're watching this on Thursday, July 30th, we'll be down at the Shipyards Park tomorrow from about 11:30 to 1, and Amber, as well as a few other artists who have been artists in the window or will be demonstrating their work, including Dee. And I'm going to stop the recording right now. So join us next week if you can. Bye for now.